Hello, welcome back to I Got Board Game.
Woo, I got board games.
I Got Board Game. And so today on IGBG Explains, John and I are here to explain the mechanic known as deck building. Deck building. It is the season for deck building. Make sure to take care of your porch. Go to Home Depot, get what you need.
Ads. Hey, sponsor this stream, sponsor this video.
So,
Home Depot,
deck
IKEA.
building as a mechanic in board games actually relatively new, and it actually was pretty much introduced by the game Dominion, which we have reviewed on this channel. And Dominion is often called the grandfather of deck building games because it really introduced that to the world of board gaming.
Mhm.
And the definition I would give for a deck building game is something to understand in comparison to what people might already know as trading card games or collectible card games like Magic the Gathering, Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon, Card Fight Vanguard. I want to keep going. No, I'm just kidding. All of those out there are collectible card games or trading card games. In general, though, those are known as or having the mechanic known as pre-constructed deck games, because with all those kind of games, you are buying your cards and making your deck ahead of time, the deck that you're going to be playing with against someone when you actually play the game. And so it's known as pre-constructed deck games
Or constructed between the two. Depending on the game. Yeah.
But then deck building itself as a mechanic is different because when you're playing the game itself, it involves a mechanic of acquiring new cards and making your deck while you're playing. And so in deck building games, you don't actually even keep the deck after you're done playing. You're just making it while you're playing the game so that you have the cards you need to win the game.
Mhm.
And so what that means, though, going off of Dominion kind of setting the standard, introducing the deck building mechanic, is that for a while in the board gaming industry, there was very characteristic ways that the deck building mechanic was included in a game. And it often included these kind of features of, at the end of your turn, you would draw up to a certain hand size, usually 5 cards from your own personal deck. And then on your turn, you would play any cards that you're allowed to or want to. And then any cards that you played or didn't played would be discarded at the end of your turn. But then also while you're playing cards on your turn, you're basically playing cards as money or currency to buy new cards from certain piles in the middle.
Mhm.
And so while you're buying and acquiring cards that way, those also go into your discard pile. So basically everything on your turn is going to go into your discard pile. You're going to draw up to your hand size, probably 5 cards again. But then whenever you don't have enough cards in your own draw pile to draw up to 5 or that hand limit, you're going to then take your discard pile, which had cards you played already, new cards you bought. You would shuffle it up and make that into your new draw pile and then continue drawing from that. So those are all the stereotypical hallmarks of how deck building was done traditionally. And so, like I mentioned, some examples of that would be Dominion and the whole line of those games. There was a Japanese one called Heart of Crown, which it seemed pretty similar to that idea. Then there's also another one that got really big a number of years back called Star Realms.
Mhm.
Star Realms, which again kind of followed those hallmarks of drawing up to, I believe it was 5 cards.
5 cards. Yep.
And you're playing them. Anything you don't play gets discarded. Things you bought get discarded, shuffle, so on. And then also it's fantasy sequel Hero Realms.
Mhm.
But these were just slightly different and gained a lot of popularity because deck building from Dominion time was often a mechanic that was used in what's known as Euro games, or basically points about victory, games about victory points. Where then Star Realms was probably the first one to then come around and make it a game about combat and specifically space combat.
Mhm.
But instead of just getting to a certain victory point amount, you're actually trying to take out your opponent first.
Yeah.
And so it kind of added combat to the way it did competition, which was a slight change.
Mhm.
But then since then, there's been even more noticeable changes to deck building as a mechanic in the industry. While John and I were talking, we kind of split it up into 3 different changes, very noticeable changes that have happened with deck building. First one being that there have been games now that change those stereotypical features that I mentioned in small ways, but it's still changing how deck building itself is done in a game. And then the second kind of category is one where games or designers try to mix deck building as a mechanic with other common mechanics or already known mechanics in their game. So, it could be deck building mixed with, say, like dice rolling, or deck building mixed with push your luck, or deck building mixed with drafting, all kinds of combinations. That's actually something that's happening a lot nowadays.
Mhm.
And then the third category is kind of a branch off from deck building called card crafting or card building, which is also pretty different, but still kind of got its origins from deck building. And so to kind of talk about that first category of games that did slight changes to the deck building mechanic itself, we have games like Aeon's End, Fort, which we previewed on this channel, and a couple more that we'll also mention. But John, you wanted to start with that?
So I'll talk about the first. But the other thing I wanted to mention as another quick general mechanic of deck building is also usually you start with a set of, I think traditionally 10 cards is the other thing, right? So as we were saying, usually it's draw 5, and most deck builders, even today, and even all the games that we'll probably talk about go forward, most of the time it's starting with this set of 10 cards, most of them, for most of them. But to start with is Aeon's End. Aeon's End is a cooperative game. So we've talked about cooperative in varying ways with different games we've reviewed. But basically, you're working together as a team trying to kind of kill off a bunch of these monsters that are coming through portals. So it's kind of this fantasy. You're playing as kind of these mages from these different schools or guilds that are working together to stop this kind of enemy. But the unique thing about the mechanics of the deck building in this game, it's 2 major ones. The first one is the fact that you don't discard your hands at the end of your play round. You just discard the cards that you played or acquired. So that's the first significant change. The second significant change in Aeon's End from the deck building side is when you need to draw new cards, most deck builders, what you'll do is you'll shuffle that trash pile or the discard pile. Sorry, not trash pile, the discard pile. That's your deck. And then you'll flip it over and then you'll draw from there. In Aeon's End, you don't shuffle. All you do is you take that discard pile, you flip it over, and you draw from the top of there. So it's very unique because that means you actually kind of know the stack order of the cards that will be coming up, which is a very different mechanic than is in traditional deck builders. So that's Aeon's End's difference.
Yeah, and so another one that just changes up how deck building itself is done is the game that we previewed, Fort, where Fort changes it up in the way that in deck building, you are obviously playing cards to then buy new cards from the center of the table or from what's known as like the pool of cards. And so those are basically always like face up piles of cards. And so you can see what you're buying. And so you're going to play cards to get enough currency in that one turn to then buy cards and add those to your discard pile, which will end up in your deck. Fort changes that up just a little bit in that at the end of your turn, the cards you played, the cards you bought will be discarded as usual. But certain cards in your hand, and basically all the cards except I think your best friend cards, are actually put into your yard, which is different from your discard pile. But then what the yard is basically kids kind of hanging around in your fort area, but then it becomes a place where then on another player's turn, they can actually recruit a kid from your yard.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that way, it changes it up by having another card deck pool that people can acquire cards from,
Mhm.
instead of just the static ones that are in the middle of the table.
Yeah, and usually in the deck building world, once you put a card in your deck, it's yours, right? And that's where with Fort, it's very unique because it's like just because you got it doesn't necessarily mean it'll be yours forever
Mhm, mhm,
from an acquired card. So that
mhm.
is a very different kind of concept. So
And so then there's another example, John.
yeah, so another example of a game that's slightly different mechanic. I don't think it's as big as these last two that we talked about is Shadow Rift, where it's also cooperative, where you're working together to defend a town from more monsters and baddies in a fantasy setting. This one is more unique in the sense that there's a lot of cards that you need to acquire that aren't used necessarily specifically in your deck, but in something that's used for the town's deck or for the town to be able to protect itself. And you need to manage that and its ability to stay alive in the midst of the cooperative game because you'll lose if the town is destroyed. And there's also visitors and other such cards that don't always. Some of them will go into your hands or your decks, but some of them will go into kind of the town area to protect. So it's kind of a difference in what you do with the cards that are being bought. So they don't always go directly into your acquired decks. And it could be a single use that you buy and that's it, right? And such. So it's a slight variation on that deck building mechanic.
Yeah,
So
and another game, then another example that has just also a slight variation is a game that was just on Kickstarter, that just funded on Kickstarter. I think is the first design being published by a company, and the game is called Endless Winter.
mhm,
Basically, kind of a caveman setting game, and having every player having their own tribe, trying to survive. And in that one, there is a deck building aspect to it. But then one slight change I do remember from reading about it is that when you play cards to then buy cards to add to your deck eventually, the cards you buy actually go straight to your hand
mhm,
instead of going into your discard first and waiting till you need to actually shuffle your discard to draw from to get that card. It goes straight to your hand. And that was, I mean, it's a very slight change to all the different ways we described the parts of the deck building mechanism. But I think it's also pretty clever because it does kind of, maybe, I mean, I haven't played it yet, but it sounds like it would help with the pacing of the game, where then it kind of skips that aspect that of delaying the card you just bought, which is common in how we've been describing deck builders, where then you immediately get access to using that card. And so, yeah, it sounds interesting. And so hopefully I'll get to try that later on with Endless Winter.
mhm,
And so these are kind of examples again of games that just slightly change the mechanic of deck building in some way.
mhm.
But then the second category we mentioned are games that actually start mixing deck building itself with other mechanics.
Yeah.
And so some examples of those that we'll kind of maybe look at are like Clank, which we have reviewed on this channel.
Mhm.
Also games like Paperback and Xenoshift,
Yeah.
which we'll also kind of discuss a little bit right now.
Mhm. Yeah. So I won't rehash Clank too long. If you really want to know, go watch our video on that. But Clank, the way that what it combines is basically adventure exploration with deck building. So basically, the decks that you're putting together, you are using to navigate through an actual board that is out there. And you actually have a particular meeple character that is moving through this dungeon to collect treasures. But that's why it's kind of similar to kind of the standard deck building mechanic in the sense that it is a Euro game. You're trying to make points, but it is a very significant mashing of this extra style of what you're supposed to do in the game. So, but again, if you want more details, go watch our video and click.
Yeah, well, I'll probably try to put those links below to the games that we actually mention here and also have videos of on our channel.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, one other example I mentioned of a game that mixes deck building with another mechanic is Paperback by Tim Fowers. And in this game, you, I believe, are Page Turner,
Yep.
and you're basically trying to write, like successful novel. And so, in a lot of ways, it follows the traditional way that deck building is done, where it's a point system game. You're playing cards to then buy more cards that hopefully add more points to your deck
Mhm.
till the end of the game. But it's different in that it mixes deck building with basically a word game. I mean, I often describe it as deck building mixed with Scrabble, because the cards you're getting are letters. Like each single card is a letter of the alphabet. And certain ones that are maybe, more common in words are not worth as many points, where if you want to buy ones that are worth more points, they might be the letters that are less commonly used. But then if you can use it in a word on your turn, then you'll have more currency to buy more. And then, and so it's mixing Scrabble with deck building, which was very clever.
And if I remember correctly, it's you have to spell words, and then based on the words you spell is what gives you the actual currency.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And that ultimately, and then you have to use that currency to either buy more letters or cards or to get the points at the end of the game.
Yeah, to buy cards that are like the novels you've written, and those count as points.
Very fun game.
And then another one example is this big guy,
Xenoshift. So apparently I'm talking about all of the co-op games now that I think. Wait, no, you're talking about this one. Never mind.
Yeah, I'm talking about this one. Xenoshift. This one is Dreadmire, but there's also a prequel version that's just Xenoshift. And so Xenoshift is basically a sci-fi co-op deck building game where the theme is basically like Starship Troopers, and you're kind of in a fort on an alien planet trying to survive the aliens coming in and attacking the fort. But then what Xenoshift did differently, and it's actually pretty uncommon to see for a lot of games, is it mixes deck building with basically tower defense, for people who know like app games like that, right? Like Plants vs. Zombies and
Bloons Tower Defense.
So for those of you familiar with that, that's what it kind of mixes in, where each player has their own lane board in front of them, where then you're playing cards onto it, which are your equipment and troops, and then monster cards are going to be added to your lane board, and basically it's kind of the order of your troops fighting the first bug or alien, and then see who survives, and you fight the next bug, or you have to use your second troop. The other difference also is that when you're playing your troops on, they stay there, so they aren't necessarily discarded as usual with kind of the stereotypical way that deck building is done. Mm-hmm. So that is kind of the unique way that Xenoshift goes about deck building and mixing deck building with this tower defense kind of mechanic. Mm-hmm. And so then the third category we mentioned, related to deck building, that's more of a branch off or gets its origins from deck building, is card crafting.
So actually I was going to say it's not just card crafting, because I thought of another game, which is the dice crafting game.
That's true.
But so I'll let you talk about that one, Ben. Okay. But I'll start off with the card crafting game. Card crafting, so there's a very specific game called Mystic Veil that draws this inspiration from the deck building kind of concept, where, as we were talking about, most of the time it's you're buying cards or acquiring cards that are added into your deck over time. But what this game Mystic Veil did, which I should have brought it out, but I don't remember. Like, I have it. It's somewhere in my stack of board games. But basically in that game is you have a set deck of cards that are yours. And what you do is you actually acquire cards and you add them into the card sleeve. So basically when you set up the game, you have this set of like 15, I think, cards that are basically blank or mostly blank. And it's a card sleeve where you're able to slide in transparent or translucent, or like transparent cards that have like printed pieces on them, and you slide them into the card sleeve itself, and you're basically creating the card, what the card will do as you play the game, as you continue playing the game and you shuffle through that deck of cards. So rather than building a deck, you're basically improving cards. And it's like, depending on the position of, what slots are available, you can only upgrade those cards that have available slots. So if a slot is taken, you won't be able to put another upgrade into that slot, right? So it's a very unique way of taking this concept of deck building, which is building a better deck, and making it, rather than building the deck, you're building the card. So.
And that mechanic and Mystic Veil itself was designed by, I believe his name is John D. Clare. Mm-hmm. And he's also gone on to do a couple other things. I think his other big one was called Edge of Darkness, which I think might also include this card crafting system.
Mhm.
And there was also a smaller game that was card crafting with trick taking called Custom Heroes by AEG. So those are the kind of limited cases that card crafting has been done in games
so far.
And then John mentioned related, actually more so to the card crafting than the deck building, right? But even branching off of card crafting or related, actually, this might have come before card crafting too, is dice building that John mentioned, which is interesting to also think of, where you then get into the realm of, basically dice rolling games, and you can think of dice drafting games where you're trying to select specific dice in turn order. Then based related to this card crafting idea, you have games like Dice Forge, which is a dice building game where you literally have 2 dice. Each player has 2 dice, and throughout the game you're rolling to get basically all the different kinds of resources and currencies, and then using those to buy cards or little tile upgrades to your dice. So then when you buy those, you'll literally pop out one side of your die and put in the new piece, which maybe is an upgrade to the amount of currency that side will get you, or whatever resource it is. And so then hopefully you're hoping that you upgrade your dice well enough so that when you're rolling, you get more things than before. And so that is dice building. Another step out from deck building, right? But all very clever ideas over these probably like last 5-10 years in the board game industry. And so, but then going back to then talking about just deck building itself overall, we are going to share our thoughts on the mechanic. We didn't do this in our other videos, like when we talked about cooperative games, but I think I've mentioned a lot of reviews. I love cooperative games, so we didn't necessarily need to say stuff like that. But I think John really wants to express his view on deck building games, so I'll give him more time for that after I give you my opinion on deck building games, which is, and John knows, I am not a fan of deck building games. I have come to enjoy them a lot over these years, particularly because of ones like Clank that start.
Because I made him play them.
Particularly because of ones like Clank. I think I really like the category of deck building games that mix it with other mechanics. Because I think as a mechanic, I don't have an issue. Like, I think it's fun, it's different way of playing a game. But I think the one thing that always stuck with me from the beginning because of Dominion is I feel like deck building is often just not thematic. And I think that's just my own taste, where I think I kind of like, in a sense, more extremes of how mechanics are done, where basically I prefer like an action point system where you do what you're choosing to do, or a dice rolling mechanic where it is all just chance what happens. Where then deck building is kind of a middle, right? Where you're getting cards that you want those effects, but there's a chance you might not draw it and be able to use it. And so it's kind of in that middle. And I think thematically, that's why I don't usually like it, because I think thematically it doesn't usually make sense. Where, like, in real life or in any kind of scenario, it's often like you're choosing to do something, or, something happens randomly by chance. But that there's a chance that you could choose, it seems kind of weird to me. Again, just thematically speaking, but playing wise, like, I do enjoy it. And so that is my view of why it just hasn't ultimately become a mechanic that I look for.
No, Ben's opinion is wrong, as we know. Just kidding. I mean, it's a fair criticism of deck building as like a thematic component to a game, or like as a mechanical aspect. And we've talked about it in some of our other reviews, right? Where there are games that can actually add the mechanic, and the mechanic actually makes sense according to what you're playing, right? And it actually kind of fits what you're doing, and it kind of makes that thematic understanding of like, oh, I can see how, if I'm really in this circumstance or situation, the way that I play the game kind of fits that. And deck building, it is kind of a weird thing when you're like, why am I limited to only being able to use one of my cards? right, in some games, or why can't I do this with these cards, right?
Yeah, I mean, just a brief,
Yeah,
more tangible example is like I think of if you imagine a deck building fighting game, right? And it's
yeah,
like, you add like punches to your deck because you want to punch, and it's like, why is it that sometimes I can punch or sometimes I can't? Like,
yeah,
shouldn't I just know how to punch? So that's
exactly.
kind of what I mean thematically, yeah.
Yeah, and that's totally fair. But getting to my opinion on deck building, I actually think it's one of the best mechanics that has come out in gaming in a very long time. And honestly, I see it because, as we're talking about, there's so many deck builders that have come out since the dawn, since kind of Dominion introduced it. And it's not even just in board games, it's even a huge hit in the video game industry, where there's so many deck building games that have existed and kind of come out. So if you are familiar with that world, games like Slay the Spire is like the number one that is out there, but there's a lot of others that have come out since then too that kind of take on that deck building concept, and similar to what we were talking about, are starting to try to find variations on how to make it not just purely this deck building, but adding in these other elements to their games. But to me, the thing that makes deck building so special, and why I think it's such an amazing mechanic, is that the game, it basically keeps freshness in a game where you have a lot of replayability to the same game over and over with a core set that you buy when you buy the game, right? Where, every time you play the game, it's going to be different, right? Like, yes, as we said, you start out with a very basic hand or a very basic deck, but usually when you play these games multiple times, it's not like the same card. A lot of the times, the same cards will not always be in the same order that you find them, or the types of cards that you're allowed to select may not be. So Dominion in the original, they always set it up where there's you choose effectively, once you learn the game, is you get to choose a set of 10 different cards that will be available for that particular game. But that set of 10 could be very different the next time you play the game, right? You can do a random draft of it. You can do a selection with the different players that you have. It gives it variability. And that's the thing to me that makes deck building so special, is that there's a lot of different mechanical and strategic ways of playing the game that will help a person try to win the game in many different ways, right? When you play a deck builder, or good deck builders that have good mechanics and are built well. We've done a review of Dominion, so you can review what we actually gave it from a rating standpoint, even though it's the grandfather of this mechanic. But
And we also reviewed like Clank.
and Clank as well, and you can see our review on that one and compare the two, right? But it's just this idea of being able to really replay the game so many times, and typically have a lot of different strategies that are involved with, in a competitive game, how you get out of it, or how you kind of get the advantage over the other players based on what's showing up in the cards you can pick up. But then also, even in the cooperative games that we've talked about as a mechanic together, is that you're building, like, there's often different strategies of what types of builds you want to put together to support your team in the long run, and you build a very different deck than the other player that you're playing with in that game. So, and it'll change every single time you play the game. So I think that, to me, is what makes deck building so special. And it's that kind of what Ben was saying, from a, not from the thematic standpoint, but more of the luck versus planning of playing a game, where it's good to have luck elements, because you don't want a game so obvious in terms of steps that it's too easy to just, it's always the same. But you also can plan out, because you have control of what you're adding in or taking out of your deck as well. And that gives people like me, who tend to be more alpha gamers, control over circumstances of how to win the game. But it's still kind of dependent on the luck of your draw and the luck of your shuffling in most cases. So all of that.
So you're saying deck building helps keep you in check, alpha gamer?
To a degree, but again, you can strategize your way through it, right? And so, but then again, yeah, like, just because you have a great buying build program, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will win for sure, right? There is a chance that you just draw all the cards in the bad order, because when you shuffled the deck, just that time, it was not in the order you wanted, right?
So yeah, so that is IGBG explains deck building. And so I hope this was helpful. If you found it helpful, please share this video with friends, family, people you want to play board games with. And until next time, we'll see you then. Bye.
Peace.